It had been a few days since Boko scared the twins as payback for Edward, and since then they showed respect to the other engines around them. However, over time the twins began to have a grudge with the Metrovic so much that they refused to speak to him at all, much to the others' annoyance. One morning, Edward was waiting patiently to depart with his first pasture service of the day. Just then, Bill pulled up with a train of empty trucks. Bill sighed. And so he told Edward about his and Ben's grudge against Boko. Edward then told the other engines at Nafford. But Edward was still unsure. Just then, Sir Topham had arrived. Edward thought for a moment. Suddenly, an idea flew into his funnel. Sir Topham Hatt was surprised. He then winked at the other engines. Sir Topham Hatt smiled. Sir Topham Hatt then left. Edward blew his whistle, then he puffed off. That night, Edward gave the news to the other engines. A few minutes later, the twins were told the news. Bill and Ben smiled cheekily. Bill and Ben were speechless. They were fine with engines like Thomas to work after them, but never the Metrovic, who was normally keep to his own work. He then puffed back to the sheds. The twins looked crossly at Boko. While Boko looked sternly back at them, it was now his time to take charge. It was already morning when Edward left, and the twins were already at work. All the same, they were cross with Boko. But that was short-lived. Boko frowned. His driver was right. Boko backed down on the coaches. He was really tired. Just then, Bill and Ben passed by and wheezed steam all over Boko. Boko was surprised. But Boko said nothing. He was too tired to reply. Things got worse later on. Construction on the new line was taking longer than expected. So Boko had to do Edward's work as well as his own. Sometimes even both in one. Sometimes you see Boko taking his morning pasture service with Edward's train of logs. The next day taking China clay trucks to the docks with Edward's pasture train. The day after he took a train of coal trucks with a train of sleepers. This went on and on for quite some time. The twins would wish at him or refuse to listen to him. Even Timothy was getting annoyed by the twins. It was a tired Boko who had arrived at Nafford Station with the last pasture train of the day. James was there. James scoffed, and he puffed away grumbling to himself while doing so. Boko returned to the sheds later that night. He was very tired and had little rest. And Boko explained. By the time he finished, Timothy was shocked. He was even more shocked when he heard Bill and Ben refuse to lighten the workload. The twins stood there crossly looking at Boko. This made Timothy really cross. Boko stood silent after hearing this. He was too tired to relatate, so instead he rolled back into the shed and went abruptly to sleep. Timothy back at the twins, and he puffed crossly to the sheds at the clay pits. Bill and Ben said nothing and went to sleep. But unfortunately, Cormoran would get them. The very next day, actually, a long train of China clay was to be taken to Nafford Harbor for another overseas delivery to Uzbekistan. The train was supposed to be taken by Bill and Ben, pushed by Boko. However, no one took any notice for Boko and his lack of sleep. But that response was short-lived. The driver turned the key, and Boko rolled slowly out of the shed. But as soon as he did, Boko stopped 5 inches from the shed. He was fast asleep. But it was no use. Poor Boko was too deep asleep. It wasn't long before Bill and Ben saw the whole thing. And so the twins ran to the front of the train. The shunter arrived and coupled them up. Before the shunter could reply, the guard blew his whistle, and the twins stormed off with the heavy train. Out of the main line, the twins began to struggle with the train. They weren't used to pulling so many cars. The twins' crews were already getting annoyed by the twins' constant arguing. Even the trucks grew impatient and began to think of ways to get back at them. Presently, they approached Gordon's Hill. The twins forced their way up the hill as hard as they could. That was when it happened. Presently, the train reached the top of the hill. The bash was so hard that it knocked Bill and Ben's crews off the footplate. Now the twins were in huge trouble. The twins thundered through the countryside. They were terrified. The twins rocketed past Henry, then sprinted past Gordon, and then charged past Donald and Douglas. There was worse to come. Up ahead was a line near the Sodor Lake. Emily was there. She was coming up the line with a small goods train. All of a sudden, there was a runaway train. Emily was horrified. And they did just in time. Luckily, no one was hurt. Back at the sheds, Timothy was oiled up for his next train, but he was still thinking about Boko. Just then, Emily arrived. Emily looked worried, especially with Edward, who usually felt with the twins of action. Just then, Boko arrived, having had a great rest. He looked puzzled. Emily explained. After the explanation, Boko was horrified. A few minutes later, Boko brought the breakdown train to the scene. Both Bill and Ben felt battered and bruised, but unfortunately no damages. All the same, Bill and Ben felt very sorry for themselves. Boko was the first to speak. Before the twins could respond, Sir Topham Hatt arrived. Sir Topham Hatt was really cross. Poor Boko looked sadly at his buffers. A look of guilt crossed the twins' faces. So just before Sir Topham Hatt left, there come a... Sir Topham Hatt turned. Sir Topham Hatt stared, both to the twins, then to Boko. Then he spoke. All the engines agreed. Soon after, Sir Topham Hatt ordered Emily to take the remaining trucks to China Clay to the harbor. She set to it immediately. Ben could still run on his wheels, but Bill had to be loaded on a flatbed for a small trip to the works. When the twins were repaired, they puffed sadly back to the sheds in disgrace. It was night when they returned. Boko was already there. There was a long silence. At last, the twins spoke. Boko smiled. All three engines smiled happily. Just then, a familiar whistle came from the distance. Edward puffed slowly into the shed. Edward smiled. His plan worked. And with that, Bill, Ben, and Boko burst out laughing. Edward then looked at Timothy, then winked, and fell happily to sleep. Edward was right.